Let's take another example to put voluntary manslaughter into context. And in this example, I want to specifically place voluntary manslaughter in relationship to murder 2 and murder 1. Here we go. Assume the defendant learns that his 10-year-old child was molested by a camp counselor, Carl, 4 months before. I want you to assume that these facts are true. Carl did molest the child. Now, defendant becomes so enraged by this information. For days, he can't sleep or eat. He's seething with anger. And if you were there in his presence, you would feel that he's seething with anger. All defendant can think about is killing Carl, the camp counselor. And so that's what he does. He forms the intent to kill Carl. He drives to Carl's home with a loaded gun. And when Carl opens his front door, defendant shoots him at point-blank range, killing him. How should the law assess this killing? You can see the intentional nature of the killing. Defendant's purposeful behavior by pointing a loaded gun directly at Carl and pulling the trigger. Defendant's the direct cause of Carl's death, so we've got the homicide covered. And prosecution can prove the theory of malice for murder 2 under the theory of intent to kill. Even without defendant making any statements, we can infer his intent to kill by his use of a deadly weapon on the victim. He purposefully shot him at point-blank range. Hopefully, you also saw facts that lean toward murder 1 and the theory of premeditation, or at least what could be argued by the prosecution as premeditation. Remember, premeditation requires that the actor form an intent to kill and reflect upon that intent. So using Bingham, our defendant who killed the woman down that isolated road, or California Supreme Court's use of the Anderson factors as ways to view the facts, we can see evidence of planning activities here. Defendant drove over to Carl's home with a loaded gun. He walked up to the door holding that loaded gun, and without hesitation, when Carl opened the door, he killed Carl. We can see that he had the opportunity to deliberate, and he did deliberate on killing him before he got in the car and the entire car ride to Carl's home. Motive, although never required to prove premeditation, is pretty helpful here. We know that defendant wanted revenge for Carl's molesting his child. This further helps to show defendant's reflection on the intent to kill. So that covers murder 2 and murder 1. But you also see a distraught parent who has killed his child's molester, a person that the law might want to accommodate. So how's defense going to do that? Defense has 2 avenues in response here. First, defense should always try to negate or defeat premeditation. That's number 1. Defense is going to want to argue that he wasn't deliberating in a cool and calculated manner that evidences premeditation. Negating premeditation, as we saw in the Bingham case, could occur when there's no actual deliberation. But it could also occur if we see a defendant acting in a frenzied manner. If a jury were to believe that, premeditation would be eliminated, we wipe it out, and we would be back at murder 2. But now defendant wants to raise a completely different argument. Defendant says, okay, I'm back at murder 2, but not only do I think it shouldn't be premeditated murder 1, I don't even think it should be murder 2. Defendant wants to mitigate the crime down to voluntary manslaughter. That's what mitigation means, reduce the crime to voluntary manslaughter under the defense of heat of passion, or sometimes called adequate provocation. He says, yeah, it's true, I did intend to kill, but it shouldn't be murder 2. It's not really malice. It should be reduced to voluntary manslaughter. I only formed the intent to kill because my child had been molested, and that created the heat of passion in me. It inflamed my passion. I lost my normal self-control. And not only did I lose my self-control, anyone in my situation would have done the same thing. And that's often how voluntary manslaughter surfaces. It looks like a revenge premeditated killing, but according to the defendant, it occurred because of these mitigating circumstances. Often, voluntary manslaughter is raised by defendant as an affirmative defense. That means in this situation and on these elements, defendant is the one who's the moving party. Defendant is the one who bears the burden of proof of voluntary manslaughter. The burden's on him to prove all the elements of voluntary manslaughter, and the prosecution is now in the position of responding to those assertions. Of course, it's true that sometimes prosecution just charges off the bat with voluntary manslaughter. But for our purposes in this class, we're going to consider that voluntary manslaughter is a defense that's raised by the defendant to reduce the charge of murder 2 down to voluntary manslaughter.